A blind date was the last thing Nick Harper needed. He was a millionaire with no time for romance and even less patience for surprises. But when his best friend signed him up as a joke, Nick agreed to one meeting. 1 hour. No expectations. What he didn't expect was her. A teacher with paint on her sleeves, tired eyes, and a little boy who didn't speak, but saw everything. When the child handed Nick a crumpled note with just one sentence, it stopped him cold. Because it wasn't just a message. It was a memory, a scar, and maybe a second chance. What followed would change the way he looked at silence, at family, and at the kind of love that doesn't need grand gestures, just someone who listens with their heart. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Nick Harper didn't like wasting time. Not in boardrooms, not in traffic, and especially not on dates arranged by someone who thought you're too successful to be single was a compliment. His best friend, Darren, had convinced him, or more accurately, ambushed him. One forwarded confirmation email and a smug text, "You're meeting her at Café Nest. 6 p.m. Her name's Rosalie. Try not to fire her." Nick had rolled his eyes, shut the message, and told himself he'd cancel. But now here he was walking into a dim cafe on a rainy Wednesday evening wearing the kind of tailored coat that made people assume he owned the building. Which in this case wasn't entirely untrue. He scanned the room. The place smelled like cinnamon and overworked espresso machines. No couples in sight, just a few students hunched over laptops and a guy on a call trying too hard to whisper. Then, near the corner window, he saw her. She was seated at a small round table with a paper cup in hand, a long dark braid pulled over one shoulder. Her coat was draped over the chair behind her, revealing ink-stained fingers and a blouse with faded chalk smudges near the cuff. But it wasn't her that caught Nick's attention first. It was the boy beside her. He was maybe 7, with tousled dark hair and sharp, observant eyes. He wasn't talking. He wasn't fiddling with a tablet or a toy. He was watching. Quietly. Curiously. And when Nick approached the table, the boy's gaze met his directly, unflinching, as if assessing a stranger through glass. "Rosalie?" Nick asked, voice low. She looked up startled, then stood halfway. "Yes. You must be." "Nick?" He nodded, adjusting his collar as he took the empty seat across from them. He glanced at the child. "And, oh." She gave a half-smile. "This is Kyle. My son. I'm sorry, I wasn't planning to bring him, but our sitter canceled last minute, and I thought, well, it's a public place. He'll behave." Nick held her gaze. "He doesn't have to apologize for being here." She blinked. Then, a fraction more relaxed, she nodded. Kyle didn't react. He simply turned to a small sketch pad in front of him and began drawing with a blunt pencil. Nick's attention flicked to the pad, then back to Rosalie. "So, what do you teach?" "English," she said. "High school. Mostly literature and creative writing." "Brave," he said. "You think teenagers and grammar are scarier than mergers and hostile takeovers?" Nick allowed a small smile. "Teenagers have more teeth." That drew a quiet laugh from her, small but genuine. For a moment, the tension between their worlds softened. The waitress came by, took his coffee order, and left with a nod. Silence settled at the table, not awkward, but expectant. And then Kyle slid something across the table. A small square of paper. Folded. Tightly. Nick frowned and picked it up. Inside, written in neat block letters, was a single sentence. "You don't need to be loud to be kind." Nick froze. The world didn't slow down. The rain didn't pause. But something inside him shifted. He looked at Kyle, who met his eyes again, calm, unwavering. Rosalie tilted her head. "Is everything okay?" He blinked. "Yes. It's just." He looked at the note again, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. "I knew someone," he said slowly, "who used to say that." Rosalie said nothing. But her expression changed, curiosity touched with something gentler. Nick cleared his throat. "Is he?" "Kyle's deaf," she said. "Since birth. We use ASL at home." He's learning to read lips, but he's shy about it with strangers. Nick nodded once. He's very clear. He's very smart, Rosalie replied, and Nick could tell it wasn't pride, it was armor. Their drinks arrived. Conversation picked up, circling safer ground. Books. Work. Rain. Cal kept sketching, occasionally showing Rosalie a page who'd nod or sign something small back. Nick didn't leave after an hour. In fact, when the waitress brought the check, he added a slice of banana bread and asked Kyle if he wanted any. Kyle gave a thumb up. He doesn't talk? Nick asked carefully. Rosalie shook her head. Not out loud. But he's got a lot to say. Nick sipped his coffee. That's familiar. Rosalie studied him. You're not what I expected. I get that a lot. I mean, you walk in here looking like a CEO version of James Bond, and then you sit here talking to a kid who won't talk back. Most men would have left. Nick glanced at Kyle again, who was now carefully drawing a coffee cup. He's easier to talk to than most board members I know. Rosalie laughed. This time brighter. Kyle looked up, saw her smile, and smiled too. Nick didn't know why that hit him so hard. Maybe because he hadn't been around quiet joy in a long time. Maybe because he had once known someone who smiled just like that, small and certain, like the world could still surprise you. He stood when they stood, walked them to the door, held it open even though it squeaked and made Kyle flinch a little. Outside, the rain had stopped. Nick offered his umbrella, but Rosalie shook her head. We're just a few blocks away. Still, he hesitated. Rosalie looked at him, then at Kyle. Thank you for not making this weird. It wasn't weird, Nick said. It was real. Kyle waved, not with his hand, but with a gentle tap over his heart. A gesture Nick didn't know how to read, but it stuck with him anyway. As they disappeared around the corner, Nick stood under the café awning a little too long. The note still pressed against his chest like a heartbeat he hadn't felt in years. Nick hadn't stopped thinking about the note. It had been 4 days since the café. 4 days since a 7-year-old boy had handed him a sentence that felt like it had been torn from the pages of a journal Nick hadn't opened in years. 4 days since he'd seen Rosalie's tired smile and Kyle's quiet eyes. And yet, here he was, sitting in his corner office, staring at that same piece of paper, unfolded, worn at the edges, while his executive assistant knocked twice before poking her head in. Mr. Harper? You have that 1 o'clock strategy call with the Berlin partners. Push it, Nick said, eyes still on the note. Sir? An hour. Tell them there's a conflict. He didn't wait for her reply. Instead, he stood, straightened the sleeves of his cashmere sweater, and walked out with nothing but his coat and the folded message in his pocket. The elementary school was smaller than he expected. Brick walls, a faded mural of animals across the front, a squeaky flagpole swaying in the wind. Nick leaned against the driver's side of his parked car and watched. He hadn't planned to come here. Hadn't told Darren, hadn't warned Rosalie, hadn't even Googled what he was supposed to say to a public school receptionist. He just wanted to see. But before he could think of a reason to leave, the front doors swung open. A rush of children spilled out like a wave. Backpacks bouncing. Voices echoing. Parents calling names. Then he saw her. Rosalie holding a small folder, waving goodbye to another teacher. She wore a cardigan wrapped tight over a loose dress, and her hair was pulled into a half-bun, half-chaos arrangement that somehow suited her more than anything polished ever could. Kyle was beside her, holding her hand, his other arm cradling a sketchbook. Nick hadn't expected to be seen. But Kyle turned. And their eyes met. For a beat, Kyle didn't react. Then, with an oddly adult sort of calm, he tugged on Rosalie's sleeve and pointed. Rosalie looked up. Nick gave a small wave, almost embarrassed. She frowned at first, confusion, surprise, and then started walking toward him. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice neither cold nor warm. Just puzzled. Nick shoved his hands in his coat pockets. I was nearby. I thought maybe. Maybe what? He hesitated. I was hoping I could talk to Kyle again. Rosalie's expression tightened. Nick, I brought something, he added quickly, reaching into his coat and pulling out a slim white envelope. It's for him. Well, both of you. She took it cautiously, opened it, and blinked. Inside was a printed pass for the local science exploratorium. A quiet day pass. Private access. 4-3. You didn't have to, eh? I know. But I wanted to. I own part of it and Mondays are their off days. No crowd. No noise. Just exhibits. I thought Kyle might like it. Rosalie glanced down at her son. Kyle, without prompting, was flipping through his sketch pad, then showing Nick a quick pencil sketch of the cafe from that night, Nick's coffee cup, Rosalie's tilted smile, Kyle's hands holding the note. Nick's throat tightened. Please say yes, he said quietly. Rosalie studied him, then nodded. The museum was mostly glass and quiet lights. They moved through the rooms in silence, broken only by the soft hum of interactive displays and Kyle's occasional gasp when a motion sensor activated something new. He was focused, methodical, touching, observing, drawing. Nick followed him like a shadow, fascinated. This is his world, Rosalie whispered, standing beside a glowing planetary model. No loud voices. No interruptions. Just wonder. Nick nodded. He's incredible. He doesn't know it. He should. He might. If someone besides me keeps telling him. She hadn't meant it to sound intimate. But it did. Nick watched Kyle trace the edges of a spinning Earth globe with his fingertip. My niece loved this place, he said suddenly. Same display. Same glow. She used to say the stars were better company than most people. Rosalie turned to him surprised. You never mentioned, eh? She died during a surgery, Nick continued, voice low. Hearing loss. Complications. I was supposed to visit her the day after, bring her a telescope. He looked at Kyle. I never bought another one. Rosalie didn't respond with a platitude. Didn't say I'm sorry. She reached over and gently touched his sleeve. That was enough. In the final exhibit room, Kyle ran ahead and stopped at a station marked, Design Your Future. It was a blank table with modeling clay, pencils, and empty wire frames. He got to work immediately, shaping something that resembled a boat. Nick watched, crouching beside him. A ship. Kyle nodded, then held up a note card and began signing slowly. Nick blinked. I don't know what that means. Rosalie stepped beside him and interpreted. He's saying this is for people who get lost but still float. Nick swallowed hard. When the model was finished, Kyle placed it gently on the display shelf. Then he turned to Nick and made a motion, both hands on his chest, tapping twice, then extending out. Nick looked to Rosalie. He's thanking you, she said. Nick didn't speak. He just knelt, looked Kyle in the eyes, and mimicked the gesture. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. That evening, as Rosalie buckled Kyle into the back seat of her car, Nick lingered by the passenger side. She turned. That was more than I expected. I'm glad you said yes. Me too. They didn't hug. They didn't promise to call. But as Nick walked back to his car, Kyle rolled down the window. He waved 3 fingers, pressed to his chin, then pushed out. Nick turned to Rosalie. What did he say? She smiled softly. He said, come back. And for the first time in years, Nick knew exactly where he wanted to return. It began with a photo. Nick didn't even know one had been taken. But sometime between the shadowlit hall of the planetarium and the final clay exhibit, someone, maybe a staff member, maybe a tourist, had snapped a picture of him kneeling beside Kyle. The boy's hand rested on Nick's shoulder. Nick's eyes, for once, looked soft. The photo was cropped tight, focused, intimate. And by Monday morning, it was circulating. Billionaire Nick Harper spotted with single mom and her child at Science Exploratorium, quiet date, or something more? Rosalie's phone buzzed relentlessly. At first, she ignored it. Then came the texts from coworkers, a few curious emails from parents at the school, and eventually a knock on her classroom door from the vice principal. We have to make sure your private life doesn't become a distraction, he said gently. Especially with the school board visit next week. She nodded, stunned. No one was rude. But the tone had shifted. By the time she got home that evening, Kyle was already seated at the table drawing his latest obsession, the ship from the museum. Over and over again, each time slightly different, each time drifting alone in a sea of white space. Rosalie put down her bag, sat beside him, and watched. "Did you like spending time with Nick?" she asked carefully. Kyle nodded. Then he paused. He pulled out a fresh page and wrote something in large block letters. "Will he come back?" Rosalie's chest tightened. She didn't answer. Instead, she made dinner, went through the motions, and when Kyle was finally asleep curled around his favorite stuffed owl, she pulled out her phone and stared at the screen. Nick had texted twice. "Want to grab coffee later this week? I found a book on planets Kyle might like." She didn't reply. Instead, she opened her browser, searched his name, page after page, companies, foundations, photos, speeches, net worth, rumors. She knew none of this before, and now she hated that she did. Nick had walked into her life like a quiet wind, unassuming, present, real. But suddenly his shadow stretched across newspapers and blogs, a man who lived in a world where even good intentions could turn into headlines. She couldn't let Kyle be part of a spectacle. Not again. Nick waited 2 days before showing up at the cafe again. It was later than usual and the place was nearly empty. Rain tapped gently on the windows and he carried a slim box under one arm. When he walked in, Rosalie was already seated, sipping tea. She didn't smile. He noticed. "I brought something," he said, taking the seat across from her. She didn't look at the box. "You didn't have to." "I know." Silence. "I saw the article," she added. Nick's jaw clenched slightly. "So did I. It wasn't planned." "I didn't think it was," she said. "But it doesn't matter." Nick looked at her. "Rosalie, I can't have Kyle exposed like that. He wasn't named. Yet." He swallowed. "I care about him. About you. I wouldn't. I don't want a savior, Nick." The words were sharp. Final. Nick leaned back. "You think that's what this is?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I've been through enough to know the pattern. The nice gestures. The gifts. The interest. And then the silence. Or the spotlight." She finally glanced at the box. "What's in there?" Nick slid it forward and opened the lid. Inside was a folded drawing. Kyle's. The ship. Nick had kept it, framed it even. Beneath the sketch, in Kyle's handwriting, were the words, "We float because we try." Rosalie stared at it. Nick's voice dropped. "He gave this to me. I didn't want it to sit in a drawer. I wanted it to mean something." She touched the glass lightly, then looked up. "I don't want to fall for a man whose life is too big for mine." Nick exhaled. "I don't want to be that man anymore." Another pause. "I don't need you to fix anything," she said. "Just show up. And stay. I can do that. Then stop bringing gifts." Nick nodded. "Okay. But if you disappear now," she added, "you don't just break my trust. You break his." That was the moment it became real. Not a date. Not an experiment. A choice. They didn't talk for a few days. Not because there was tension, but because there was space. Needed space. Rosalie returned to her classroom. Nick returned to his boardroom. But the space felt different. He carried Kyle's drawing in his briefcase now. It lived there between memos and market reports like a heartbeat. He didn't send flowers. He didn't send toys. He just sent one message. "Friday, 6 p.m. I'll be at the cafe. If you both feel like tea and banana bread." That Friday, as Nick sat near the back booth, Kyle appeared first. He was holding a new sketch pad. He slid into the seat across from Nick, opened the pad, and flipped to the latest drawing. This one wasn't a ship. It was 3 figures, stick people, one tall, one medium, one small. They were standing beneath a starry sky. Underneath, written in uneven letters, "We're better when you're here." Nick didn't speak. He couldn't, because for the first time in a long time, Someone had told him he belonged, and they hadn't needed words to do it. The school auditorium was nothing special. The kind with creaky chairs, scuffed wooden floors, and a stage that always smelled faintly of tempera paint and nervous energy. But tonight, for Rosalie, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. She paced behind the curtain, stealing glances at Kyle through the side opening. He stood by the other children, fidgeting slightly with the hem of his sweater. His sketchpad was tucked under one arm, and he kept glancing at the front row of the audience. At the empty seat beside her, Nick hadn't come. She told herself it was fine. She had told him about the school's inclusive expression night offhandedly, not as an invitation, just a casual mention. He hadn't promised to attend. He had meetings. He had a life. But Kyle had noticed. He had asked twice before dinner, "Is Nick coming?" And both times she had offered a non-answer. She regretted that now. A student stagehand signaled to her. It was time. She knelt beside Kyle and signed slowly. "You're ready. I believe in you." Kyle nodded. Still, his shoulders slumped slightly as he walked to the center of the stage. The room dimmed. A soft spotlight bloomed over him. He stood there in silence. Then he opened his sketchpad, propped it against the easel, and began to sign. It was a poem, one he had written weeks ago. Rosalie recognized the flow of his hands, the way his gestures painted images in the air. But there was something different this time, a hesitation, a wait. Halfway through, he froze. The room held its breath. And then, a rustle from the back of the auditorium. Footsteps. Someone entered through the side door. Rosalie turned. Nick. No coat, no entourage, just him. Slightly out of breath, holding a paper bag in one hand. He slipped into the front row, took the empty seat, and looked directly at Kyle. The boy blinked, then lifted his hands again, and continued. His fingers moved faster now, smoother. He poured the rest of the poem into the air like music only some could see. His eyes never left Nick. At the end, Kyle paused, looked down, then stepped forward and pointed to the final page of his sketchpad, which he held up. Drawn in marker, a man with a tie, a woman with a ponytail, a boy in between holding both their hands, and beneath it, in shaky handwriting, "You don't need to be loud to be loved." Rosalie closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. The room erupted into quiet applause. Afterward, in the quiet hallway near the lockers, Nick found them. Kyle rushed forward and hugged his waist without hesitation. Rosalie watched, guarded but moved. "I thought you weren't coming," she said. "I was late," Nick replied, brushing Kyle's hair back gently. "Boardroom hostage situation. You came anyway." He looked at her. "I couldn't not." She exhaled. Nick turned to Kyle. "You were incredible." Kyle beamed, then raised his hands and began to sign something. Slow, deliberate. Nick hesitated. I don't know that one." Rosalie stepped closer, translating softly. "He's saying, 'You were the quiet in my storm.'" Nick's throat tightened. He dropped to one knee and faced Kyle directly. "You were mine too." They stood like that for a moment, a silence fuller than words. That night, Rosalie made tea in her cramped kitchen while Kyle fell asleep on the couch, still in his sweater from the performance. Nick leaned in the doorway, watching. "I was going to bring banana bread," he said, "but I grabbed something else instead." He handed her the paper bag. Inside was a paperback. "Signing for Beginners. How to Speak with Your Hands and Listen with Your Heart." She turned the book over slowly. "I want to learn," Nick said. "Not just phrases. I want to speak to him the way he deserves." Rosalie didn't answer immediately. She just set the book on the counter, turned, and kissed him. No build-up. No grand swell of music. Just quiet, certain warmth. When they parted, she whispered, "We've had enough people talk at us. I think it's time someone talked with us." Nick nodded. They didn't say much else that night. Didn't need to. Some conversations aren't spoken. They're lived. There was no big announcement. No grand "we're together now" declaration. Just small shifts. Nick started showing up on Sundays, no suit, no driver, just a canvas bag filled with snacks, books, and ideas for things to build. Rosalie started leaving a second coffee cup on the table without thinking. And Kyle? Kyle began drawing 3 people more often than one. One afternoon, Nick sat at the small kitchen table while Kyle showed him a new sign, a twist of fingers that meant silly. Nick mimicked it awkwardly, earning a grin. Rosalie, standing at the sink, caught the moment and smiled. Not because it was perfect, because it was theirs. That night, while Nick dried dishes and Rosalie wrapped Kyle in warm blankets, the little boy whispered, not out loud, not with his mouth, but with his hands and eyes and the way he held onto Nick's sleeve, "Sha," a nickname. Not Nick, not Dad, just Sha, the way children name the people who stay. Nick froze, then gently touched his chest and signed back, "Thank you." It was a few weeks later, while walking past Kyle's school, that Nick stopped in his tracks. A group of kids were huddled outside, waiting for pickup. Some signed, some spoke, a few just watched. He saw the rust on the railings, the peeling paint on the portable classrooms, the cracked pavement near the steps. And then he saw Kyle helping a smaller boy zip his backpack. That night, after Kyle had gone to bed, Nick made a call. "I want to fund a new wing," he told the principal. "Not in my name, in Kyle Turner's. Full accessibility, soundproof classrooms, visual alert systems, art space, and one condition: Rosalie Turner chooses the team." The principal was speechless. Nick wasn't. He just smiled, said thank you, and hung up. Rosalie found out 2 days later, when the school board mentioned an anonymous gift with suspiciously specific requests. She knew immediately. When she confronted Nick, he didn't deny it. "Why?" "Because you fight every day to give him a world that listens. I can at least help you build it." She stared at him for a long time, then said, quietly, "Okay, but if you ever do something like this behind my back again, I'm signing you up to chaperone the kindergarten camping trip." Nick laughed, the kind of real laugh that made Kyle peek into the room with curiosity. He was still holding a paper flower he'd made at school. He offered it to Nick, then turned and ran back to the living room. Nick looked down at the crumpled stem in his hand. "I've gotten a lot of deals," he said, "but that might be the most important one I've ever earned." The photo on their fridge wasn't posed. Kyle had snapped it with Rosalie's phone. Nick holding a cup of juice, Rosalie half laughing, her hair tangled from the wind, and Kyle in mid-blink. But it was real, so they framed it. Beside it hung one of Kyle's newest drawings. A treehouse, 3 stick figures waving, and a tiny sign that read, "Home is where people listen." The day of the school's new wing opening, Kyle wore his favorite blue shirt and insisted Nick button it just right. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was quiet. No cameras, no press, just teachers, students, and one new metal plaque on the wall. The Turner Center for Quiet Learning, for those who speak with their hearts. Rosalie stood beside Nick as Kyle pulled the ribbon free. No speeches, no headlines, just the sound of one hand finding another. Later that week, they walked home beneath a soft spring rain. Kyle held an umbrella too big for his hands. Rosalie glanced over and whispered, "You know, it started with one sentence." Nick smiled. "I remember." Kyle looked between them, then pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a new drawing. 3 people, a puddle, a cafe, and in the corner written neatly, "The end." Kind of. Rosalie laughed. Nick kissed her temple, and Kyle splashed through the puddle like it was the beginning of everything. Because maybe it was.